It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. We are now marching toward the 300th episode of Monster Mondays, which will be released at the end of this month. However, before we get there, we do have more business to attend to, and that business begins in Sault Ste. Marie in Ontario, just across the border from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Here, we're going to get into the ooey-gooey Lovecraftian horror of 2016's The Void. Now, this was a little bit of a surprise hit from the indie horror scene back in 2016-2017, as this kind of coalesced the correct bits of everything that made this movie visually appealing and appropriately spooky. This was one of a handful of feature films and shorts from the Canadian film groups that referred to themselves as Astron 6. These groups were best known for more comedic horror films, and most of their films were seen through various genre avenues like film festivals and the like. And the two directors that made The Void were Jeremy Gillespie and Steven Kostanski. Now, for the most part, they were art department guys, and they worked on some pretty big productions like 2016's Suicide Squad, 2017's It. They did some makeup effects stuff for Star Trek Discovery. And both of them had individually worked on Guillermo del Toro productions like Crimson Peak, Pacific Rim, and The Shape of Water. Kostanski also ended up making another indie darling, Psycho Gorman, in 2020. And he also worked in the makeup department on this year's film, In a Violent Nature. The Void is a whole other beast for this pair. It's much more serious in tone, and it had the movie basically released without Astron 6's name on it due to that much darker and darker tone and lacking the kind of typical sense of humor aspect that the group's films tended to have. The idea came from Gillespie, who was working at Pinewood, adjacent to where Guillermo del Toro was trying to get his At the Mountains of Madness production off the ground. At the Mountain of Madness is the famed H.P. Lovecraft adaptation that del Toro has been more or less working on for years without getting it finished. To be honest with you, I'm not even sure he can ever get it started, let alone into production so it can be finished. But all that talk of Lovecraft really got Gillespie's brain working, and it's basically the origin of the unique look of this film and the otherworldly monsters at the heart of this movie. So let's get into what's going on in The Void and kind of talk about that Lovecraftian horror that makes up this movie. So our movie begins with a crime scene. A man and a woman escape from a farmhouse that's kind of in this remote portion of this very rural town, only for the woman to be shot in the back. One of the assailants pours gasoline on the woman, and the man who shot her drops his lit cigarette onto her to finish the job. The man who escaped is then chased by the two assailants, and in the house, one of the interior doors had this black triangle painted on it. That black triangle also adorns a mysterious figure in a white hooded outfit looking over the burned victim's body as it kind of burns away. Elsewhere, a deputy named Daniel Carter finds the escaped guy crawling on the road. This escaped guy's name is James, and Deputy Carter takes him to a remote hospital whose quiet night is about to get very interesting. At this hospital, Carter's estranged wife, Allison, works as a nurse. The couple separated after the loss of their child during childbirth. Some strange things start to happen at the hospital right away. Lights flicker, TV reception in the rooms go in and out, radios stop working, and the head physician on duty this night is Dr. Richard Powell. He seems like a pleasant old guy who stayed put at the hospital after a fire ravaged the place, forcing most of the resources to be moved to a town that's not insignificant ways away. It's a lot of the reason why this hospital is extremely quiet, with mostly bored staff and a skeleton crew. Also in the hospital is Kim, an intern, a patient named Cliff, who may or may not be friends or involved with Kim in some way. There's a pregnant woman named Maggie, and her grandfather, Ben. Another nurse there is Beverly, but Carter soon discovers Beverly is doing something pretty grisly. He sees her murdering Cliff, and her face has been completely removed. When she approaches Carter with the scissors that she used to kill Cliff, he shoots her dead. The staff is then confused and terrified by the events, and Carter is also rather shaken by this. While he tries to kind of get his senses back about him and try to figure out what it was that he just saw and did, Carter has a seizure during which he has a strange vision of an almost alien world. When he comes to, a state trooper named Mitchell has arrived. He knows of the murder scene that James escaped from and is there to take James into custody, saying he also believes he slipped Beverly something that caused her to become murderous. Carter goes to call in the events of the evening and discovers that no radio is working. The phones aren't working either. Even the radio in his cruiser is not working. There he starts to see several people in those white robes with the black triangles. One attacks him and tries stabbing him, but he escapes into the hospital, albeit wounded. Elsewhere in the hospital, weird tentacles start crawling out of Beverly's face. And as Carter loses consciousness from his wound, he once again has a vision of the alien landscape. But this time he also sees a man standing in front of a triangular portal. When Carter wakes up again, Mitchell explains that those hooded figures are surrounding the hospital, but they aren't coming inside. At least not yet. Meanwhile, the transformed body of Beverly is trying to attack James. And if that's not enough, the two guys who shot and killed the girl and James was running away from at the beginning of the movie show up at the hospital ready to kill pretty much anyone in order to get to James. Now, defending himself, James takes the pregnant Maggie hostage with a scalpel, screaming that they will all die in this place. And when Dr. Powell tries to calm him down, James stabs the doctor in the throat and seemingly kills Dr. Powell. The tentacle creature that was Beverly then enters the fray and grabs Mitchell and begins to shove its tentacles into the trooper's face. The two murderers from the beginning of the movie shoot and axe the Beverly creature to pieces and also hack away at Mitchell's body just for good measure. So we're at a situation now where the hooded guys are holding steady outside while the remaining survivors are holed up inside, but as prisoners of the two murderers from the beginning of the movie. Maggie's pregnancy starts to get a little dicey, where Allison and Carter need to basically do a couple of things separately to help her. Allison needs to go find medicines, but Carter knows that they need to get more weapons in order to protect themselves before doing anything more. So he goes outside with the two guys from the beginning of the movie to get the shotgun and ammo out of Carter's cruiser. But it appears that the cult guys have moved the cruiser away from the hospital's entrance, making it a little bit more of a tense situation as they have to separate themselves even that much further from the hospital. And as they go to retrieve the ammo and the gun, the cult members start closing in from the surrounding woods, and they all carry these daggers. And the tenseness of Maggie's condition becomes more dangerous too. Strangely, the hospital is kind of a safe space because, like I said, the cult members do not come into the hospital. They just seem to be waiting. And we learn that the murders really aren't that. The cult killed the younger of the pairs, who is Simon, and the older one, Vincent, was basically got him out of there and out of the cult's clutches before basically they could sacrifice Simon as well. But soon it's discovered that old Doc Powell is part of all this. In fact, he's the leader of the cult. He tells Carter that he plans to help everyone and that the death of his own daughter changed him so that he could seek out this way of basically conquering life and death. So Vincent and Simon, along with Carter, begin to question James about the cult, but he only knows kind of basic stuff like that they would watch people have sex and perform blood rituals, kind of typical cult type stuff. But Powell also knows how to transform people into horrible creatures, like Beverly. So they go to the portion of the hospital that was damaged in the fire because Powell has taken Allison hostage when she went to go look for medicine for Maggie, and she was doing so before Carter could really get the weapons or anything like that to help protect her as she did that. Basically in the special lab within this portion of the hospital, Powell has set up a little table and a little workroom, and Allison wakes up on that table, and Powell explains to her that he's put something inside her that is growing, and he's also cut his own face off. But what's growing inside Allison is quite large and is moving around in quite unsettling ways. Now, while Allison comes to terms with Powell having done something to her, Vincent, Simon, James, and Carter are in the corridors of the abandoned part of the hospital. There, they discover some of Powell's experiments. These are all people who should be dead, but he's not allowed them to die. One in particular is constantly bashing its own head into a pipe, leaving this giant gaping hole in its face, but it still can't die. As these corpses begin moving and attacking, James is killed while the other three get temporarily separated, and they start having to deal with visions, basically indicating that this portion of the hospital has become something of a hellscape. And each one of them are dealing with these visions of something that is very specific to each one of them. Back in the main portion of the hospital, Kim witnesses Maggie kill her own grandfather, revealing that she's carrying Powell's child and is a member of the cult as well. And that's when the cult finally pour into the hospital. Kim runs away and hides as Maggie makes her way to where Powell is. Now, Carter finds Allison and is reminded of when she was pregnant with their child. However, when the illusion fades, he sees that Allison has been completely mutilated and transformed into a giant tentacle creature. Realizing that she's more or less dead, he begins hacking her tentacle body to pieces. Powell then basically teleports Carter to a morgue where there's this giant glowing triangle on the wall. And the triangle is the titular void and a gateway into a world where Powell has conjured creatures older than time itself, which gave him power over life and death. And in this room, Carter is then stabbed by Maggie, who is carrying the reborn version of Powell's long-dead daughter, Sarah. Powell opens the void, and soon Maggie's body pretty much explodes as a giant Sarah monster is born out of her. Vincent and Simon arrive to try to destroy the monster Sarah, but it's a bit too strong for them. Vincent covers the creature with alcohol, and Simon lights the thing with a flare. That also kills Vincent, but Simon is able to escape as Carter faces off with Powell, leading to the two of them falling into the void. Simon is able to get back to the hospital after escaping the monster Sarah. He finds Kim, where they basically leave safely, and Carter is reunited with Allison on that strange world that he's had visions of, and as they look up into the sky, they see a giant black pyramid hovering over them. So let's talk about the three things I like about the void. First, I love me a good isolated hospital horror movie. I think a lot of this has to do with growing up with like Halloween 2 and to a much lesser extent Halloween 3 and the early scenes of Friday the 13th, the final chapter. I like to say I've never seen a hospital in this sort of situation, but that's not necessarily true. If you're at a hospital late enough at night or at the right time of day on the right type of day, be it a weekday or a weekend, you could walk down a hallway at a hospital and see no one else around. And it is kind of a creepy feeling because you don't hear nurses, you're not hearing patients, you're not hearing anything but maybe passing by a room where a TV is on. But that's not what you typically think of when you think of hospitals. I think we're all kind of conditioned by TV shows like Emergency or ER or Grey's Anatomy or something. And yeah, I just did bring up an emergency reference there. I swear I really am only 47 years old, not 80. But anyway, there's in those types of shows, there's always some sort of thing going on. There's emergency rooms, people rushing around and solving problems, people coming in with gunshot wounds or knife wounds or whatever. But in this movie, you've got a barely functioning hospital with a skeleton crew on a spooky night and monsters inside and weird cult guys on the outside. You kind of think of hospitals as places of healing and whatnot, but here you've got a situation where the hospital is partially the last refuge, and also a place of terrific horror. And you will always stand a pretty good chance that my attention will be piqued by having a horror film in a remote, quiet, and mostly empty hospital. Second, right from the onset, the void moves quickly and never really lets up. Understand that some of the reviews from critics who aren't uniquely into genre movies complain about the movie not really having much of a plot. But I don't really think that's what the movie's intention was. I mean, the movie moves and plays out like a nightmare. We're shown visions of a strange world that kind of looks like something we'd recognize on Earth, but it's just enough different where you really realize you are peering into another dimension. Pal is clearly shown to have died, but he returns later. Motivations of people almost seem to shift and change. And we see things we can't quite fully comprehend. All the while, the movie cooks. It begins with James running out of a farmhouse where Vincent and Simon pursue and start blasting away at people. Then it's moments after Carter arrives at the hospital that things kick into that next gear. So, you get into a situation where the first 5 or 10 minutes of the movie are incredibly fast paced. It really moves through a lot of things. And even when the movie slows to catch its own breath, the movie really doesn't slow down. It's kind of like taking a break after a sprint, only to still feel your heart rate racing. It's a pretty fast 90 minutes, and I appreciate that it doesn't slow down too much for dull exposition. What exposition it does provide just heightens the nightmarish qualities. And it kind of trades the exposition for just throwing monsters at you and the creepy guys with the cult hoods and outfits. But third, and maybe the thing the movie has going for it the most, is that this is a really good looking movie. Not only does the movie look like a film with a relatively decent sized budget, the creature effects, the way it's shot, it looks like a film made by a guy like John Carpenter who's been at it for decades. And I mentioned budget, and yeah, I mean, this film was made on only about 82,000 Canadian dollars. And while it is a movie that is kind of a downer in terms of pretty much everyone dies or gets turned into some sort of tentacle monster, except for a pair of characters who are kind of the least interesting people in the cast, directors Kostansky and Gillespie really did make a movie that has all the visual gore delights of a Clive Barker or H.P. Lovecraft movie. You've got the Lovecraftian tentacle monsters and the concept of beings that are older than time itself. You've got a guy who follows the Hellraiser type of character who is obsessed with unlocking secrets and ends up more or less flaying his own skin off to transform into something greater. It's a gory mess that does kind of have an effect on you. I mean, you're seeing things and you're not entirely sure what it is you're looking at or why it's there or how it got there or whatever, but you know it had an effect on you. And I think a lot of that is that it's a good looking movie that makes you kind of want to keep watching it no matter what conclusions you reach when it's all over and you reflect on what it is you just spent 90 minutes with. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next week, Monster Mondays heads to South Korea for the 2006 monster movie, The Host. And until next week, stay spooky.